Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is November 5th. I hope everyone is doing well. We need to go ahead and get started. When we left off last time, we were talking about socialism, which is not the happy utopian socialism that Robert Owen had been pushing, but this is Marxist socialism, which calls for an aggressive overthrow of the capitalist regime, the workers taking over the means of production. And this is a political and economic force that is still very much in play today. There are many socialists in the world today, and even nations that operate under a socialist ideology. The truth behind the sort of pure Marxist socialism is that it never really creates the quality of life that its supporters hope that it will. Inevitably, factories in socialist regimes turn out junk. Workers don't have the drive to work as hard. That quest for profit, that quest for success just doesn't seem to be there. Socialist regimes tend to turn into dictatorships, and they tend to suppress freedoms because if you let people vote, people will vote out socialism, and so the socialist leaders can't have that. One interesting way of looking at it is capitalism, which is what we live in the United States, is very good at producing quality, a quality of life, but maybe it's not so good at making sure everybody has it, right? There's a lot of people that are left on the outside. Socialism is very good at making sure everybody has something, but they just don't have much. Everybody gets a share, but that share happens to be very, very small. I don't know, but you kind of have to decide how much of this you support. We all agree that workers should get paid more. We all agree that people should be able to enjoy the benefits of their labor. At the same time, we also like to think that you should be able to rise up and you should be able to make money and that capitalism has its benefits. And so where you stand on this is up to you. But just know it's still around. It's still very much here. I want to very briefly talk about the spread of colonial rule. I want to talk about the spread of colonial rule, and this is definitely tied to capitalism because capitalism requires growth. Businesses have to grow. Industry has to grow. Economies have to grow. It's just the way the free market works, and the Industrial Revolution brought this to light more than anything else. And so as nations like Britain and France and yes, the United States grew these industrial systems, they needed raw materials to run, to give the factory something to work with. And they also needed markets for the produced goods. If my factory is making lots and lots and lots of widgets, and every year my intention is to sell more and more, I have to find new markets. I have to find new places to sell it. And so in the late 19th century, particularly with Europe, we begin to see a resurgence in colonialism. And a new term emerges that we will simply call imperialism. We will simply call imperialism. And what happened is these nations of Europe, particularly Western Europe, started going throughout the world and conquering huge sections of territory that up to that point had largely just been left alone. And these indigenous people had never really had much contact or interaction with the Western world, and now all of a sudden the Western world is there taking them over. And what Europe wanted was those raw materials that those indigenous people are sitting on, and then if they can conquer them and turn them into colonial subjects, they can turn around and sell those industrial goods right back to them and make more money. The best example of this was Africa. The best example. The truth behind Africa is that although the West had been interacting with Africa for hundreds of years, we're all familiar with the triangle trade and all of that, the truth of the matter is almost all of that was West Africa, specifically the Congo River Valley and, what is present day the coasts of nations like Nigeria and Ghana. The vast majority of Africa's interior was largely left alone. It's pretty amazing to think about this, but as late as the 1870s, no white man, no European was ever known to have even gone into Africa. the heart of Africa, the interior. There is a city named Timbuktu. Y'all have heard of Timbuktu. It's a real city. It's in the present day state of Mali. And there was actually a prize that was offered to the first European that could go to Timbuktu, come back, and verify that he had been there. And this was as late as the 1870s. There was another man by the name of Stanley Livingstone who made it his life's purpose to sort of explore Africa. And he went all throughout Africa. And then finally, when someone went to go find him, all he had to do was go from village to village and say, hey, where's the white guy? Because, I mean, he was like the only white dude in Africa. And so, he eventually found him, and there's a big story behind that. Well, the one thing we need to know about Africa is it is incredibly rich in terms of natural resources. Every kind of mineral, every kind of material, everything an industrial economy could want is in Africa. And so in the 1870s, these European nations decided we are going to bring Africa under our thumb. And the conquest of Africa is clearly an example of how technology has radically shaped the power of these nations. In the year 1884, Otto von Bismarck held a conference in Berlin, and representatives from all over Europe showed up, and they simply rolled out a giant map and carved Africa up among themselves, creating a series of European colonies that were extremely large, much larger than the mother countries that are doing this. And that way they wouldn't have to fight over it. Africa is so gigantic, they argued, we can fight over all of this, or we can just carve it up among ourselves and do it peacefully. And so you can see here, the map that they created of colonies is very similar, of course, to the modern map of Africa, because these colonies would later become independent. But you'll notice French West Africa is kind of way up there in the north, that light green area, that huge area of the Sahara, but then also in the south, all French. The British got the Sudan and Kenya, and then, of course, you can look in the south, what is today South Africa and Botswana and Zimbabwe, which was at one point called Rhodesia, Zambia. All of these very big countries all fell under the umbrella of the British Empire. Look at the Belgian Congo, right? That giant section in the middle. That is 1/3 the size of the continental United States, and Belgium is about 1/3 the size of Mississippi. Okay, and Belgium rules all of that land. And you'll notice the Belgian Congo, there's a tiny little area right on the water there, right? That's, of course, by design. We get all of this interior and everything in it, and then we're going to have a tiny little piece of land on the ocean so we can export everything that we're taking from it. Now, it's important to know, where's the map here? It's important to know that the African people were not given a say in this. The millions and millions of indigenous Africans were not at the European meeting in Berlin with Otto von Bismarck and all those other schmancy Europeans in their fancy clothes. The Europeans divided this up without asking the African people at all what they thought about this. And the map that they created follows various geographic markers, but it does not in any way follow any type of tribal or cultural borders within Africa. And so by carving this up, African tribes that were traditionally rivals were now forced to live among each other. Some tribes were divided because, again, the Europeans didn't care. In the case of Belgium, they actually created new African tribes. In what is today Rwanda, they created two tribes that they called the Hutu and the Tutsi, simply because they wanted to create sort of a ruling class of indigenous people and a servile class of indigenous people. So I'm not making this up. They rounded up lots of these Central African people, and the ones with lighter skin, they decided were now going to be called Tutsi, and the ones with darker skin were now going to be called Hutu, and the Tutsi were going to be the ones who ruled over the Hutu. And it was all made up by the Belgians, which gives you an idea of the kind of mentality that we're talking about, and you can connect the dots. This does not work out well, right? This does not go well at all, or at least for the people that are conquered. Now, of course, when the Europeans showed up, and I'm simplifying this very much, these Africans have said, no, we're not playing along, right? Forget this. You don't conquer us. We've got our own kingdoms. We've got our own cultures. We've got our own tribal identities. You can't just show up and decide you're the boss of us. But what did the Europeans have that the Africans didn't? Guns, yeah. The Europeans had modern weapons and the Africans didn't. And so when the Europeans showed up, they were able to conquer these indigenous people, even though they were much smaller in number. I mean, there's only a handful of Europeans and all these Africans, because when I've got guns and you've got tribal weapons, it doesn't take a genius to figure out who's going to win. Also, actually, a more common practice was to simply bribe and corrupt the African leadership. Here's this tribal chief. He rules over lots of people. He's very powerful. You show up with a big pile of gold and tell him that, he's going to be even more powerful if you just work together. He can either take the deal and work with you, or you're going to overthrow him and put somebody else in charge. And so generally speaking, these African leaders would be forced to go along. But when they fought back, it was absolutely brutal. One example of the Zulu Wars, when the British were conquering South Africa. The Zulu were a very powerful tribe, and the Zulu kingdom pretty much ruled almost a quarter of the continent in one way or another. And the British showed up with guns and just slaughtered them and crushed the power of the Zulu. And that meant that South Africa was now under the rule of the British. And so this happened all across the continent. In the Belgian Congo, the Belgians were just brutally cruel to these people. When you read the stories of what they did to sort of break the power of these tribal governments and the just severe brutality in terms of extracting the resources, it's just horrible. It's just terrible to think about. But anyway, this is and they did the same thing in Asia, just in case you're wondering. All across Asia, exactly the same thing happened. Now, they did not do this in the Western Hemisphere. By this point, the United States is strong enough to tell Europe, stay out. There was talk of recolonizing South America, but the United States would not permit that to happen. The United States had a policy called the Monroe Doctrine, which in 1823, the United States put its foot down and said that it would no longer tolerate European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. And the Monroe Doctrine was still in effect, is still in effect. And so Europe stayed out of the Western Hemisphere. But the new term that we're going to use is imperialism. The creation of these giant empires where one nation completely rules over other people. And we will see the creation of gigantic European empires by the turn of the 20th century. This map here is the British Empire. The red there is the British Empire. At its zenith, 1/4 of the Earth's surface was ruled from London. And the saying was, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because, all around the world, there it is. India, for example, is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. India is a subcontinent in and of itself. There are hundreds of languages, hundreds of millions of people, all ruled from London. And that doesn't include, of course, Africa and these other places in Asia. I mean, the British Empire was just gigantic. I mean, again, 1/4 of the Earth's surface is ruled from London. And the French Empire, all of these lands around the world, all of these colonies that France rules, is equally big. And of course, there's going to be critics of this. Don't think that others weren't just sitting back and doing nothing. Here's a caricature of a Frenchman and a British, standing on the coast of Africa, cheering how, they're civilizing the world. But of course, they're standing on the bodies of all these dead people, right? And then here is a Thomas Nast cartoon. This was in the United States. Harper's Weekly was the magazine, and it's, the world's plunderers, and it's these European nations, and they're just taking whatever in the world they want, ignoring the well-being of all of these other indigenous people. And for the most part, the United States was and still is an anti-imperialist country. We don't like this. The United States policy is that everyone should get to govern themselves. Now, we've talked about liberalism and nationalism, right? There's issues there, but generally speaking, the United States opposed this until our own industrial base grew to the point where we needed to do the same thing. And so the United States in the 1890s will kind of get in this game, and we will take Hawaii, for example. We will take Puerto Rico. We will take Guam. We will take the Philippines. We will start having colonies of our own because we're subject to the very same economic pressures that we find in Europe. So we don't like imperialism unless it benefits us, if you will. And Puerto Rico, by the way, is still an American colony, right? The Philippines was given independence. Hawaii has become a state. Puerto Rico is still, we don't call it a colony, by the way. We call it a protectorate. We changed the name, right? But Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. I mean, it's there you go. And there's always been talk of Puerto Rico becoming a state. What I find is so interesting is so many people don't even realize that Puerto Ricans are Americans, right? Puerto Ricans are American citizens. That's the United States. People think it's a foreign country, and it's not. And that just sort of baffles me. But in any event, there are those that find this pretty appalling. One very strong voice of anti-imperialism during this era was Sam Clemens. You also know him as Mark Twain, the author. And he wrote extensively about how this is evil. Going in and conquering other people for your own benefit is not good. And Sam Clemens was such a celebrated writer at the time. People listened to him, but I guess money speaks. Let's talk very briefly about China and Japan, though. And I don't have a map. Oh, goodness. Nope, I don't have a China and Japan. So I've just got to mention it. Thought that I had this. Hold on just a second. Okay, very briefly, I found a map online here of East Asia. I just kind of want to show it to you. It's not perfect, but we'll work with it. Within the age of imperialism, and as Europe is conquering these different sections of the world, East Asia is undergoing its own transformations, and is Southeast Asia. You see, Europe is conquering Africa. Europe is conquering farther south in the Indian Ocean. And during the 19th century, China was seeing a very rapid decline of its imperialist regime, of its own empire. China had been ruled by a group of people known as the Manchurians for a few hundred years, but of course Chinese history is thousands of years old with one dynasty after another. And during the 1800s, China was sort of dissolving. It was starting to fall apart. The Chinese emperors were losing their power over the country. Britain had already become deeply involved in China, selling opium along the coast. Britain actually fought 2 wars with China known as the Opium Wars, which again were very lopsided victories because the Chinese did not have modern weapons. The British had taken Hong Kong as a colony, and Hong Kong is a Chinese port city. It's the largest port in China. It's down in the south. You can see it here on this map. And so China is in turmoil. Now, there was very real fear that the British would simply colonize China. Britain already has India, which is just as big. Britain already has sections of Africa that are just as big. You have to understand that mainland China is the same size as the continental United States, and the fear is that Britain is just going to take that too. Now, in the 1890s, the United States spearheaded what it called the open door policy, which, much like the Monroe Doctrine, demanded that no nation in the world colonize China. And it's basically a pointer right at Britain. And the rest of Europe went along with it. And so there was an agreement that China would not be turned into a colony, yet at the same time, China is deeply, deeply exploited. The French, the British, yes, the United States, other countries are going in China, doing what they want to do, trading, extracting wealth, making deals with regional warlords that have now broken away from the emperor. And China is, for lack of a better description, kind of going down in flames. By the year 1900, for example, 25% of all men in Chinese coastal cities were opium addicts because the British were just selling opium in China as fast as they could do it because newsflash, drug dealers make a lot of money. And there was nothing the Chinese could do about it because China didn't have a modern army, China didn't have a modern navy, and as we already mentioned, the empire is itself dissolving. Yes?
Why did they just stop buying opium?
Once you become addicted, you can't. That's the whole point. Opium is such an addictive, powerful drug that when you introduce it into a society, I mean, it's, once people start using it, you don't stop. You might not know this. 90% of all opium addicts never recover, ever. They never quit using it. And opium, when I say opium, I mean heroin, I mean fentanyl, I mean morphine, Vicodin, hydrocodone, the happy painkillers that the doctor will give you. Those are really just heroin. It's just opium. It's all basically the same stuff. The best way to describe opium in terms of the various opiates, it's kind of like if you look at alcohol. If you take a bottle of whiskey and you take a bottle of wine and you take a 12-pack of beer, it's all alcohol, right? I mean, you can call it whiskey or wine or vodka or whatever, but it's all alcohol. It's all the same stuff. Same thing with opium. Opium, heroin, fentanyl, morphine, Vicodin, hydrocodone. It's all heroin. It's all opium. It's all the same stuff. Just different strengths. Just different strengths. Which is why you don't play around with it. You don't recreationally use any of it. And just because the doctor prescribes Vicodin doesn't mean that you need to just take Vicodin for no reason, because what you're taking is really heroin. And yeah, the British figured out very quickly that they can just import. They were growing it in India and then moving it over to China and selling it to the Chinese.
Wasn't the Chinese government taking it in?
The Chinese government couldn't do anything about it. I mean, the British ships would show up in the ports and sell it. And of course, the Chinese weren't happy about this. I'm not making this up. And the Chinese empress wrote Queen Victoria and said, please stop selling opium in our ports because it's destroying our cultures. Queen Victoria wrote back and said, hey, if people don't want it, they don't have to buy it, right? And then, of course, admittedly, she didn't understand addiction the way we do today, but the idea was we're going to sell it to these people because we can charge anything we want once we get them hooked. And then the Chinese finally decided to push back. And so they raided the British ships. They threw the opium into the water. They announced that the British could no longer trade in China. So then Britain sent the Navy and just obliterated the Chinese Navy, conquered the ports in what we call the Opium Wars, right? Forced China to open its port to British opium. And then the Chinese tried to do it again. There was a second opium war, and the British took Hong Kong and said, not only are we going to crush you and we're going to sell opium in your ports, and we're taking Hong Kong. So, yeah, I mean, imperialism is brutal. I have no other way to put it. I mean, that's just the most honest way to put it. And here's where it gets real interesting. Since you brought it up, we might as well mention it. Part of the agreement when Britain took Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is just a Chinese city. That's what it is. It's a port in southern China, the biggest port, and the people of Hong Kong are ethnically Chinese. Britain took Hong Kong, but the open door policy wasn't in effect then, but there's a real concern by the rest of Europe that they'll colonize the whole country since the British are kind of doing that. There was an agreement that they would give Hong Kong back in 1997. Okay, now understand 1997 is well over 100 years later, like 150 years as a matter of fact with the agreement, if I remember correctly. And so nobody was thinking anything about it. Fine, they'll deal with it back then. But it was on the books and it was a treaty that they signed. So the 1970s, Hong Kong is still a British colony. The 1980s, Hong Kong is still a British colony. China is now radically different than it had been back then. China has undergone World War II. China is now a communist nation. China has gone through its own turmoil internally. But the Chinese government kept reminding Britain, by the way, in 1997, you give us Hong Kong back. That treaty is still in effect. We haven't forgotten. And so sure enough, in 1997, Hong Kong went back to China. And so Hong Kong went from being a British colony to effectively a Chinese colony. And there was an agreement that Hong Kong would still remain quasi-independent, that it wouldn't be incorporated into China completely right away, and that Hong Kong China would give Hong Kong 50 years to sort of get used to being part of China again. And recently, in the past 2 or 3 years, there's been protests in Hong Kong. If you notice on the news, the people of Hong Kong have been protesting because they don't like what China is doing to them. They were part of Britain for so long that the people of Hong Kong are sort of a little different than the mainland Chinese. And they operate under sort of a different government, and they're not too happy with how China is involving itself in Hong Kong's affairs. And it's also worth noting there's another former Portuguese colony, Macau, which is also kind of under the same thing, only the Portuguese had it instead of the British. So China's gone through an awful lot in the last 150 years. There's just no other way to put it. And this is the point that I'm making. By 1900, it is obvious that China is about to have a very difficult century, and most definitely China did. Let's go across the water here. Off the coast of Korea is Japan. And Japan is different than China. Obviously, it's a lot smaller, quite a bit smaller. It's very mountainous, it's very rugged, it has a lot of earthquakes. As a matter of fact, only about 20% of Japan is habitable because it's so mountainous. And Japan doesn't have any natural resources. It's limestone. I mean, it was pushed up from the ocean floor as a result of earthquakes. And so Japan has no oil, it has no coal, it has no iron ore, it has nothing. No natural resources to speak of. And so Europe had largely left Japan alone. Europe was not interested in Japan. And the Japanese culture is very homogenous, right? Because they're on an island, it is not a multi-ethnic society at all. Japan, much like China, is ruled by an emperor who is practically worshipped. And the Japanese are certainly smart enough to know that they're looking around the world and they see that these ugly white people with big noses are conquering all of these indigenous people, right? And the Japanese don't want that to happen to them. And they are deeply, deeply concerned. And they're looking at what's happening in China and they realize the minute these Europeans show up here, they're going to start doing that to us. And so in the 1860s, the United States actually forced Japan to establish diplomatic relations. We showed up with gunboats and we forced Japan to let us have an embassy there because they didn't want to have anything to do with the outside world. Well, in 1867, Japan got a new emperor. And Japanese culture revolves around the emperor. It is the Emperor Meiji. And he doesn't matter. He was just a puppet, but this is known as the Meiji Restoration. And to prevent imperialism from happening to them, to prevent becoming like the Zulu or the Chinese or any of these other people, in 1867, Japan decided to rapidly modernize. Modern army, modern navy, modern education, modern infrastructure, modern everything. Japan is going to go from a feudal society to a modern society at light speed. Because the Japanese understood if we don't have the ability to fight off European imperialism, we're going to be the victims of it. The Chinese lost the Opium Wars because they didn't have a modern navy. They didn't have a modern army. They didn't have the guns. The Zulu were defeated because they didn't have the guns. We're going to have the guns. And so between 1867 and 1900, Japan effectively forced itself to become a modern state. And it was very rapid and it was very aggressive and extremely controversial within Japan. A lot of Japanese people did not like all of the changes that were taking place, but the entire nation of Japan was just so different just within a generation. They even created the capital of Tokyo. Tokyo was not the traditional capital of Japan. Kyoto to the south is the traditional capital. But they built a whole new capital of Tokyo, turned it into a capital because it was seen as a better option for a modern state. Well, once Japan has this modern army and has this modern navy and is now considered a relatively powerful nation, as I mentioned, Japan doesn't have natural resources, right? Japan doesn't have coal. Japan doesn't have iron ore. Japan doesn't have the ability to maintain this industrial economic growth. And so Japan then gets into the imperialist game itself. Japan goes from being a nation that's trying to fight off these outsiders, and it becomes a nation that starts invading and conquering other parts of Asia. And it starts by invading Korea, and then, of course, into the 20th century, it starts moving into parts of northern China, becoming an imperialist power just like the Europeans. And if you want to know how did that lead to World War II, well, the Japanese are aggressively moving in Asia. They will eventually invade China and do horrible things to the poor Chinese. I mean, just terrible conquest, just brutality within China. And the Japanese wanted the Philippines, and we had the Philippines. The Philippines was an American colony. And we, of course, in the 1930s, we embargoed Japan. We were very much against all of this expansion. So they decided to bomb Pearl Harbor as a way of teaching us a lesson in keeping the United States from involving itself in their affairs. And their logic is if they could neutralize America's Pacific Fleet, they could take the Philippines and there would be nothing the United States could do about it because we wouldn't have a Navy in the Pacific. And that did not work out well at all. They completely underestimated what America was going to do if they bombed Pearl Harbor. Yes, they did neutralize the American fleet, but they didn't destroy America's carriers. But more importantly, they didn't understand the American worldview. When they attacked us to try to get us to stop, all they did was make us determined to defeat them. So it was just a military miscalculation. But Japan modernized to fight off imperialism, but then used its new power to conquer others. I guess that's just kind of human nature, right? Once nations have big, powerful armies, they use them. You can't have a big, powerful army without using it. And unfortunately, we've learned that more in the 21st century too. But moving on. That sets the stage. That sets the stage for World War I, which is what I want to talk about now. So we're drawing a big new line in our notes. And we are now going to talk about the First World War, which just radically changes everything. And we have now gone 100 years since that war, and it was so tragic. But we got to talk about it. And now let's get back to Europe. And very quickly, the 20th century is such a unique time. Because if we take a snapshot in the year 1900 and we discount all of the imperialism that's going on and all of the cruelty, the truth is, if you live in the Western world, the 20th century looks remarkable. The 20th century looks like it's going to be just an entirely new era of human existence that is just so great. I mean, think about it. We're building more than we've ever built before. Industry is growing economies by leaps and bounds, introducing new levels of wealth that had never been known before. And we can debate capitalism and socialism all day long, but sooner or later maybe we'll figure that out and everybody can share in it, right? And the idea is sooner or later we will. We're producing more food than we ever have. For the first time, not only does most of the population not need to be farmers, we've gotten into the 20th century now, most people don't have to farm. But there is more food than people could possibly eat. Food is cheap, it's abundant. Hunger in the Western world is no longer there. I mean, the people in France who, engaged in a revolution just a little about 100 years earlier over bread now have more bread than they could possibly eat, right? The food's everywhere. Medicine, think about science and medicine, right? We're about to start curing diseases that have just devastated civilization for hundreds, thousands of years. We're now figuring out how to prevent all of these different illnesses. And the idea is as we move into the 20th century, disease itself might become a thing of the past simply because we can cure anything. We can cure anything. The idea to travel, the idea to explore the world, the idea to have, the idea that you can have all these new experiences. You can now read any book you want. You can learn anything you want to learn. You can go anywhere you want to go. This is just amazing. Your average, ordinary, working person now has access to more comfort than kings would have had access to just a few generations earlier. And so the idea that the 20th century is going to be remarkable permeates the Western world. Well, historians call the 20th century the horrible century. Because, yes, that happened if you were fortunate enough to be in the right place for it. But also, the 20th century saw more conflict, more bloodshed, more just overall nastiness and war than every other century of human existence combined. We fought a war where we killed more people than every other war humans have ever fought in the world combined, many times over. And then just a few years later, we turned around and made an even bigger war that killed even more people. We fought the next war where we killed twice as many people as we had in the first war. So, how is it that we're on the verge of this remarkable advancement in human civilization where everybody can eat and everybody can be comfortable and everybody can be healthy, and yet we slaughter each other like we never have? It's a real paradox, isn't it? It's really kind of crazy. And the answer to that is technology. Because the reality is technology is neither good or bad. Technology is simply a tool. And how we choose to use that tool is up to us. We can use technology for good, growing food, curing disease, making people more comfortable, or we can use it for bad, right? Blowing people up and slaughtering people and waging war and conquest. Imperialism was about technology, right? If the Europeans didn't have all of those fancy weapons, they would not have conquered Africa, they would not have conquered India, these other places. And the British actually had conquered India a lot earlier, but they did it with guns. So it's how we use the technology. We have to decide as a civilization what we're going to do with technology, and we just simply haven't done it yet. We haven't come up with a clear policy. Are we only going to use it for good? Well, I'm not sure we're there yet. Well, with that in mind, let's talk about Germany. Let's talk about Germany. You will recall, I'm going to have to go back to part 3. You will recall, we don't need to do William yet. Oh. You will recall that Germany unified in 1871, and this created a whole new great power in Europe, vastly stronger than Prussia before it. And German intellectuals, German thinkers, German leaders began to argue that Germany was now going to enter its place in the sun, that Germany was now going to dominate Europe. France had had its opportunity. The Spanish had had their turn a long time ago. The British Empire, of course, is Britain's turn. Germany, to these leaders, had never really had this opportunity. Germany had never been in that position. And in their mind, this was just simply not fair. So Germany will now own the 20th century. The largest economy in Europe, the largest population with the exception of Russia. Germany begins to rapidly industrialize. Between 1871 and 1900, Germany easily became Europe's largest industrial power, with economic growth year in and year out. And Germany also came to believe, the German leadership, that the British and the French and the Russians were certainly not going to yield to Germany peacefully. That almost certainly this would require war, this would require conflict, and that Bismarck logic, where if you get in our way, we're just going to steamroll you, that had made Germany unified. Austria got in the way, Germany defeated Austria, France got in the way, Prussia defeated France. So Germany is fully expecting to fight another war to secure its position on top. And Germany is looking to the east and seeing Russia as a very real threat, with the Russian economy growing and the Russian nation becoming more influential. And of course, the British, with the British Empire continuing to grow. We just talked about imperialism. And so there's this expectation that sooner or later, war is going to happen. And we have to be prepared for it, and we have to be prepared to win, and win quickly. And they firmly believe that they will. So Germany starts putting huge amounts of money into its military, building just massive military industrial complexes, thousands, millions of various military components. Germany goes on a campaign to build its navy. The German Navy didn't much exist in 1871, but by 1900, Germany has a whole fleet of battleships and other naval vessels, all designed to be able to defeat the British vessels. German spies were able to examine the British Navy, and they designed their guns specifically to be able to penetrate the armor on British ships. Well, Britain knows this is happening, so Britain, of course, starts doing the same thing. France knows this is happening, so France starts doing the same thing. Russia knows this is happening, so Russia starts doing the same thing. And so before you know it, all these nations are building these gigantic armies. There's no war going on. Nobody's fighting anybody, but for some reason, we've got these armies that are absolutely gigantic because, of course, at any minute, we might go to war with you or you or you. Germany realizes that it needs allies. Germany realizes that we could probably use a friend on our side. And so Germany looked south to the Austrian Empire, which on paper is in the club of the big powers, but in practice was slipping away. All these different ethnic groups were pushing for independence. The Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph is getting older and sort of less competent. The Austrian military may look good on paper, they build it up too, but the Austrian military is divided. All these different ethnic groups sort of have their own military units. But Germany needs a friend, and so Germany turns to Austria as an ally. And you got to keep in mind, the Austrians and the Germans are both ethnically German, at least the Austrian part of the empire, so it kind of made sense. Italy, as a newly unified nation, is also turned to as an ally. Now, I'm jumping around in the time frame, but that's okay. We need to get this going. And so don't worry about the times here. But Germany, Austria, and Italy formed a military alliance that they simply called the Triple Alliance. And the Triple Alliance was pretty simple in practice. If any of us gets attacked, we go to war against whoever did it. So if we are attacked, we are at war with any country that does it. We can rely on each other. The Triple Alliance. Realizing this threat, France, Britain, and Russia decided to form their own alliance. And they would call it the Triple Entente. They would call it the Triple Entente. Now, when the war starts, to keep things simple, we're going to call the Entente the Allies, and we'll call the Germans and the Austrians the Central Powers, because that's kind of a more accurate term for them.